Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me again, and welcome to any new viewers. This is To the Point English with Ben. I'm Ben, and I have to admit, I'm quite nervous about this video because I'm going to be taking the speaking paper of the C1 Advanced Cambridge English exam, also known as the CAE exam. So yeah, I'm nervous because I've given so many tips in my videos and in my online courses and to my students who I help prepare for these Cambridge English exams. And now I'm putting myself in their shoes, in their position in the exam, and going through the speaking paper. And I'm going to be evaluated by a former Cambridge speaking examiner. In fact, my guest today has 24 years experience as a Cambridge speaking examiner, so he really knows what he's doing. But you also may recognize my examiner today because it's Craig from the fantastic and very popular podcast, La Mansión del Inglés. I recommended that podcast in a previous video of mine from last year because it's one of the best podcasts out there for English learners. And I'm going to chat to Craig a little bit before we start the speaking test. Because he's not just a Cambridge examiner, he's a very experienced teacher, and he has a lot of content on his website and in his podcast, and he has also courses. So he's a really interesting English teacher to know about. So I recommend you follow him on all the channels. Okay, so let's get started. Hi, Craig.
Hi, thank you for having me on your channel, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here. Really happy.
The pleasure's mine. Thank you for coming. As I said, you may know Craig from his podcast. I recommended the podcast in a previous video of mine. I think it was last year. I mean, it has the Spanish name, but I think it's apt for all English learners, right, Craig?
Yes, predominantly Spanish speakers. They seem to like it very much,
Mhm.
although we have listeners from all over the world. So it's inglespodcast.com is the place to listen online or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Mhm. Yeah, great. I'll link to that in the description, of course. But before we get started, Craig, maybe you can just introduce yourself a little bit more. Just tell us about yourself.
Sure. Before we put you in the hot seat, Ben, I'll just say that if you haven't seen me before online, my name's Craig. I live in Valencia, Spain. I'm originally from London, and I've been teaching and examining Cambridge exams. Well, I was for about 24 years, and I stopped just during the pandemic when it became very difficult to continue teaching in classrooms. And I teach 100% online now. So I teach for the exams, but I mainly do conversation English, and that's what I do. I still love teaching, even though I don't get to be in the classroom with flesh and bone students in the flesh.
Mhm.
But I still do really enjoy teaching and meeting people online and helping them improve their English.
And you have these conversation classes, don't you, that you offer online? So can you tell us a bit more about those, Craig? Because they sound really interesting.
Yes, they're mainly for people who have studied English in the past, mainly B2 and C1 and also C2 level students, but they're for people who have a reasonable knowledge of grammar and vocabulary, but they don't have the opportunity to practice and speak English. So we focus on discussions, debates, role plays, presentations, and the focus is to get you speaking as much as possible on Zoom online. And then I'm there to give help and feedback and suggestions on how you can improve your pronunciation, your expressions, and the way you express yourself in English.
Mhm.
So those are the courses, and I'm trying to start a B1 level, which will have more of a focus on grammar and
Mhm.
vocabulary to get students up to B2. So hopefully that will be launching in a month or so. So yeah,
Great.
if you're interested, I'm sure there'll be a link below the video. Then
Mhm.
get in touch with me and I'll be happy to help you.
Fantastic. Yeah, do that. I think it's a great opportunity for people. People are always asking me, how can I practice my speaking and get feedback from a professional teacher? And there's your opportunity. So I think we're ready to go. So as I said, part one is the interview. So really, I'm just going to hand it over to Craig. And from now on, Craig is going to be the examiner or the interlocutor. So the interlocutor is the examiner who speaks to the students and directs the questions to the students. And I'm going to be the candidate. So here we go.
Okay. Well, good morning. My name's Craig, and this is my colleague Sue. And your name is?
My name's Ben Gill.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Can I have your mark sheet, please?
Mhm.
Thank you. Well, Ben, first we'd like to know something about you. So, where are you from?
Well, I'm originally from England. I was born on the outskirts of London, but then when I was very young, I moved with my family to Cambridge, to a quaint village um, on the out in Cambridgeshire, the county of Cambridgeshire. But now I live in the north of Spain, in Asturias.
Thank you. And how long have you been studying English, Ben?
That's a good question. I've been studying English basically all my life. As I was born in an English speaking country, I would say I didn't really have to study English. I just acquired it naturally, having been born and lived in an English speaking country for 26 years.
Thank you. Ben, if you had more free time, how would you use it?
Hmm. I think I would spend more time doing sports activities. Now, as I'm getting on a bit in age, I'm not a spring chicken anymore. I think it's very important to keep fit and healthy. And I'm sometimes frustrated that I don't have enough time to run, for example, to go jogging, maybe to do some more fun activities like playing tennis or that kind of thing. So yeah, I would say if I had more free time, I would like to do more physical activities, more sports.
Thank you. Do you think you've changed very much in the last few years, Ben?
Yes, I do. I think I've as I've got older, I've learned more about myself as a person. Um, I've calmed down a bit. Perhaps when I was younger, I was um, going out with my friends more, and as you get older into middle age, you start to prefer staying at home and watching TV and a slightly
Thank
more
you. Thank you,
relaxed.
Ben. Thank you. That's 2 minutes. Now, notice I stopped Ben in the middle of the sentence. If that happens to you, don't worry, don't panic. It's because these tests are standardized and the examiner's looking at a clock, as I am. And at the end of 2 minutes, to be fair to the other candidate, then they will say thank you. And if you hear that thank you, that means you have to stop talking. So maybe it's a good idea to keep talking until you hear the examiner say thank you. And then you know you've said enough.
Yeah, that's a very good point because that's something I have to do in my classes when I play the role of the interlocutor. I hate it, to be honest, because a big part of an English teacher's job, I think, is to encourage your students to speak.
Exactly. It's very counterintuitive. You don't want to stop the students, but the timing
Exactly.
and Cambridge say that you have to stop them.
You
Yeah,
have to be fair. Yeah,
have to
exactly.
be.
Um, well, how did you how would you evaluate my performance in part one of the speaking paper,
Terrible,
Craig?
Ben. Absolutely terrible. There's no way you pass there. Complete fail. No, I'm joking,
I
of
knew it. I
course.
knew it.
Very, very good. And there are a couple of things I'd like to emphasize. First of all, the way Ben kept talking. And when he wasn't quite sure, well, will you tell us, Ben? I don't know if you were very sure what to say, but you used a lovely expression. You said, well, that's a very good question. And I often suggest that
Mm,
students use that to give you a couple of seconds to think. And you can say, that's a very good question.
mm,
Hmm, let me think for a minute. It's okay to do that. And it's
mm.
okay to leave a slight pause if you think the question's difficult. And it gives you time to think of vocabulary and what you're going to say. Did you do it on purpose or did it come up naturally?
I think it came up naturally, but I think at the same time, I kind of, because I've practiced this so many times with my students, it's something that, and I've recommended it to my students that it's almost automatic. Uh, because yeah, I think it's a good idea. Some people need time to gather their thoughts before they speak. Most people do. I'm one of those people in whatever language I'm speaking. So yeah, I think it's very useful just to say that's a good question. Other things you could say, I know some of my students have used say, oh, I haven't given that much thought before, but so obviously you have to say something, but
Yeah.
or that's a tricky question, you could say, if it is a tricky question. Usually the part one questions are not that tricky, but it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. These are very good techniques also for interview questions, which can also
Mm-hmm.
be very tricky and difficult sometimes. If you learn 3 or 4 of these filler expressions to give you time to think, then you can pull out one of these expressions or two and use them in any English situation where you're being interviewed like this exam.
Yeah, it's a good point. There are lots of parallels between interviews and exam situations, so it's good. Now, you mentioned, and it's very important that the interruption, and it's interesting to be on the other side of things because it is quite, oof, he's interrupted me. I wasn't expecting it.
I did it on
Well, I should
purpose.
have.
Yeah.
No, it's good. Yeah, it's good example. So that's good. Now, one thing a lot of students tell me, because I always recommend to my students, as you said, just to keep on talking. So for that first question, where are you from, which is almost always the first question, isn't it? I always, tell my students to have don't rehearse or practice or have learned by heart what they're going to say, but have, some idea of what they want to include, some vocabulary they want to use, like quaint is the typical adjective that a lot of people use. That's why I deliberately, I really did grow up in a quaint village. I didn't just use that because it's a good word, but you don't need to tell the truth in your exam. But my question is, my students often say that they're interrupted before they can really say much at all. After that first question, they just say, I was born in London and I grew up in Cambridge. Okay, thank you. Now, is that common, or does it depend on the examiner or the interlocutor, or does it depend on the day of the exam, would you say?
Well, there's two things I'd say about that. The first thing is I would not just give a one-word answer. Where are you
Yeah.
from? Oh, London.
Yeah.
No. Valencia. No. Make sure you expand that a little bit. And that is a question that you can prepare beforehand, because there's a very good chance they're going to ask you where you're from. It's an icebreaker as well. So I would not make it too long, but also not too short. So, for example, I would say, well, why don't you ask me, Ben, where I'm from?
Okay. Craig, where are you from?
I'm from a suburb of London, and I grew up on the east side of the Central Line.
Okay, that's enough. Yep, that's
Yeah, I mean
right.
that's answered the question, but it's also extended the answer, because at this level of C1, what the examiner's looking for is that you can extend and you can give a slightly longer answer with more detail.
Yeah.
So I would make sure you've got something prepared for that,
Yeah.
and describe where you're from and where you grew up. You can
Yeah.
use the expression born and raised if you grew up in the same area where you were born. So, yeah, born and raised in London, in a
Yeah.
suburb of London.
Yeah, good. I think that's a good example. I think that's the most important thing, because I was going to ask you that anyway, the length of the answer. What's the perfect length of answer in this first part? And it's not too short, not too long, is not one word answers. But I always recommend, because the examiners, the interlocutor can and will interrupt you, and that's fine. Then it's better to, if anything, speak more than less. So to keep speaking.
Definitely speak more and less. And also knowing that they will interrupt you and they'll say thank you when they want you to stop, then you shouldn't be worried or nervous when that happens. But it's better to keep speaking and be interrupted, in my opinion, than to just give answers that are too short. And then there's an uncomfortable pause while the examiner is waiting for you maybe to add something.
Exactly.
So just try to speak naturally and speak until they stop you. They are in control of the test, of the interview. So they will let you know if you're speaking too much. Don't worry about that.
Yeah. And it has to be fair, doesn't it? It has to be fair. They have to give you an opportunity, give you the chance to speak, but also that it has to be fair, not only for your partner, but for everybody who's taking the exam. They can't give you extra time. The speaking test passes very quickly. It's about 15 minutes in total. You have to divide that into two, because there's two partners, two candidates, and then take away what the interlocutor says. You're going to have about 5-6 minutes to speak, probably about 6 minutes to speak. So, okay, so not a bad start then, Craig, you'd say. So
yeah, I think you definitely got through part one okay. I'm looking forward to part two, which is a bit more testing, perhaps a bit more tricky, but part one I think you sailed through with flying colors.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. Yeah, I'm a bit nervous about part two, because it is probably the most challenging part of the speaking paper, I think. Mostly because of the time limit. You only have 1 minute, as the interlocutor is going to explain in a moment. Now, one thing we can't do here, or we're not going to do, because it's quite tricky, but And you have to remember, we can't do the extra question. So I will have my question on the pictures. I will speak for a minute answering the question. In the real exam, there will then be an extra question for my partner to answer on my pictures for about 30 seconds. We're not going to do that today. I'm just going to do the 1 minute task, which is really the main task to do. So, okay, yeah, we'll do it, and then we'll talk about what I could improve.
Okay, are you ready?
I am.
Now, Ben, here are your pictures. They show people spending leisure time with water. I'd like you to compare two of the pictures, please, Ben, and say how the people might have prepared for these activities and also how they might be feeling. All right?
Yeah. Okay. In both pictures, we can see people having fun on water. In the first picture, I think we can see what looks like a family in a canoe on what's probably a lake or maybe a river. Whereas in the second picture, I think it's perhaps a father and son fishing on the sea. I think in the first picture, I don't think the family needed to prepare that much for this activity. It's not very challenging or strenuous, just paddling across a lake, but perhaps they needed some safety preparation. Whereas in the second picture, perhaps the father taught his son a little bit about how to fish, because that's quite a big fishing rod I think he has. I think in the picture with the family, they're looking very happy and relaxed, just enjoying time together. And in the second picture, the father also looks happy, but the son looks quite stressed and perhaps a little bit nervous about trying to catch his first fish. But yeah, generally they all seem.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
Yep.
it's very difficult to judge the time, the 1 minute. So
yes, but again, you don't have to. When you're taking the test, you don't have to worry about the timing because it's the interlocutor who's going to time you and stop you after 1 minute. And the reason they will stop you after 1 minute is so that every student has 60 seconds, and it's fair to every candidate. So don't worry again about being interrupted.
Exactly. How strict are you with that minute? Is it exactly when the minute's up, or do you sometimes give a student a couple more seconds, a candidate a couple more seconds, or are you very strict?
Well, when I used to examine a couple more seconds, yes, but I noticed that you'd pretty much summarized your thoughts on that second picture, and then you were going to add something else. So I didn't want you to get started on another area, another sentence, another train of thought. So then I decided to cut you off, which was actually at 59:59.
Okay.
So it was fantastic. It was 1 minute exactly. But yeah, 2 seconds after 2 or 3 seconds, I don't think that makes too much of a difference.
No.
I don't think Cambridge would like me saying that, but that's my personal opinion. But yeah, really, it should be as close as possible to that 1 minute. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing I should mention, although I've never actually done this task before in this context, I've helped and practiced this with so many students that I know the kind of rhythm and speed you need to talk at, and when you need to speak about the first question. So that's really what you need to do if you're preparing for this exam, is to practice as many times as possible to get a feel for how long 1 minute is. As Craig correctly says, you don't need, when you're in the task, you don't need to be thinking too much about it, because that will distract you from what you're saying. But get this sort of instinctive, automatic response almost. So you're only focusing on what you're saying. You don't need to worry too much about other things. Before you give me your evaluation, I have one more question. How important is it, would you say, that the candidate answers both of the questions on the page?
Very, very important. You must make sure that's the most important part of this part of the test, is to answer those two questions. And you also can read the questions, because they will be on the paper that you're given that show you the pictures. So the examiner will ask you the questions verbally, as I did, but you'll also see them written, and make sure you hit both of those questions. That's very important.
Right. Yeah. And of course, we haven't mentioned, but you have to be comparing, not comparing and contrasting the pictures, but not describing. As I've said many times, inevitably, when you're comparing or just talking about the pictures, you will describe some aspects of the pictures, but that's not the task. It's to compare two of the pictures and answer the two questions.
Yes.
I do have a couple more questions, but Craig, perhaps you could give me your evaluation of my performance.
Well, I thought you did very, very well indeed.
Oh,
Very, very
well.
well indeed, Ben. You did compare and contrast the pictures very nicely at the beginning, and I also recommend that obviously students do that. But very quickly, you got to the questions and you answered them. And of course, because they are pictures, you're never really 100% certain of what's happening in the pictures. And Ben did that very well. He used language that showed he wasn't sure what was happening. He said, perhaps they are, a couple of times. And that's what I think the examiners like to hear. They like to hear the modal verbs. They could be, they might be, perhaps they are. Um, I would think. So that kind of language where you're hypothesizing and you're interpreting what is represented in the pictures, in the photographs, is very, very useful. And Ben did that very well. He also said, I think they are. So that kind of language is good. Yeah, you used obviously you used the tenses correctly. There You said they're looking very happy because when you're describing pictures, you often use the present continuous. They're paddling in a canoe. They're looking very happy. They're having a good time. But again, let's go back to the most important thing is answering those two questions. So as soon as you have said how the pictures are similar and how they are different, contrasting them, then get to those questions as soon as possible and get those questions answered.
Yeah, it's that feeling. Just keep moving. Don't I've had experiences with students who spend like 40 seconds just before they even start answering the questions. They're just comparing, and then they just have 20 seconds to answer both the questions. It's not going to happen. Yeah, and you mentioned this sort of speculation vocabulary. Almost always, or often in the questions, you will see the word might, and that immediately it's not how are the people, or sorry, how have the people prepared for these activities, or how are they feeling. It's how might they be feeling, because as Craig says, we don't know. It's impossible to know. We have to speculate. If you say they are very happy or they are having a good time, it's not appropriate vocabulary because we don't actually know that. So
exactly. One other point I made a note of is that you contrasted with that connecting word whereas, which is very, very useful. Whereas in the other picture, the people are blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So make sure you use expressions like that. Whereas, on the other hand, however, those contrasting linkers are very, very useful.
Yeah, because you're comparing. That's why I always recommend you start by saying in both pictures we can see, and then you're immediately going to talk about a similarity. There is always a similarity in the pictures. In this case, they're all on water. And then if you use whereas just to connect the pictures, then you're just signaling that you are comparing, not just describing. Before we move on, a couple more questions. The most common question I get from my students during this part, or when they complete this part of the exam, is, did I use enough advanced vocabulary? So my question is, how important, because it is really tricky, even if it's your native language. I mean, and you're a teacher who has prepared students for this, it's difficult to force in or to actively use advanced vocabulary. So, of course, it is one of the criterion, but how important is it from the examiner's point of view that the candidates use advanced vocabulary in this part?
I think what I would notice more, rather than looking for or the students needing to remember to use advanced vocabulary, I would be listening for vocabulary that was too basic. I would be listening for, like, is this candidate really a C1 candidate with a C1 level of vocabulary, or do they keep repeating the same words again and again, and they're very basic vocabulary? So that would stick out like a sore thumb, which means that would really be obvious if they didn't have a variety of different vocabulary to describe the pictures. So rather than get stressed and anxious about, am I using advanced words? I think just use the level of English that you have, which should be C1 when you take the exam,
Mm.
and just try not to repeat words, try to use alternative words when you're describing something.
Again, yeah.
Also, don't forget that your knowledge of vocabulary will be very, very much examined in the use of English and in
Mm.
your writing.
Mm.
And in your writing, you do have more time to collect your thoughts and choose words and choose expressions. Whereas in the speaking, just try to be as natural as possible, but be aware, be conscious of the fact that you shouldn't be using too basic language and you should be using a variety of words and expressions to speak about the pictures.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very true, isn't it? That the examiners expect to see a higher level of vocabulary, a wider range of vocabulary in the writing than the speaking, right? Because they're not, it's a different skill. It's so that they're not
Yeah,
expecting you to use all that fancy vocabulary in the speaking that you should use in
exactly.
writing. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to part three now, which is the collaborative task. So this is the first time in the exam where the candidates interact, where they talk to each other. And that's very important. Interactive communication, that was the criterion I forgot earlier, but it is extremely important in this part, of course. So again, we'll talk more about it when we finish, but in this is where Craig has to multitask, has to be the interlocutor and the the candidate. So
Yeah.
so ready when you are, Craig.
Okay, well, now I'd like you to talk about something together for about 2 minutes. Here are some things that might make people happy, and there's a question for you to discuss. First, you have some time to look at the task. Now, talk to each other about why doing these things might make people feel happy.
Okay, well, I think I'll start. And I'm going to start with doing physical activity because it's the one that I relate to most because I like to run. And I think this makes people feel happy because I think there's a chemical reaction, there's endorphins or some chemical that makes you feel happy. I know that when I'm in a bad mood and I go running, it often cheers me up and it can change my mindset for the rest of the day. How do you feel about that, Craig?
No, I agree. I don't do as much exercise as I should, perhaps, but those endorphins do give you some rush, some feeling of exaltation and make you very, very happy. But let's move on to communicating with others because I think it's been shown in studies that if you do have a very good and strong social circle, then that does help you be content and happy. Do you agree?
Completely, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's essential nowadays, or in all through human history, I'm sure, to have a tribe or a group of friends and family to communicate with. You know, it's for many reasons. I think definitely affects our happiness. I would also like
Absolutely.
to talk about listening to music because, again, that's quite a personal one for me because I'm a huge music fan, and I think it really, again, when I'm feeling a bit down, maybe a bit depressed, and I put a CD or an album on that I like, or MP3, I should say, nowadays, then it can lift my mood a little bit and just make me feel better than I felt before. What's your thoughts on this, Craig?
Yes, I agree 100%. I enjoy listening to music to wind down at the end of the day and relax. And although I should probably listen to more up-to-date music, I think the music that makes me happiest is the music I used to listen to back in the 80s and 90s. So I'm old school, but I do really enjoy listening to music that I enjoyed when I was 20 years younger.
Yeah, me too. Completely. Yeah. And even looking at nature, I think is very important. I think just being in nature and looking at nature, I think that again, that's scientifically proven to have an effect on our state of mind and our mood. So being in nature, looking at mountains and trees and just not just
Thank
looking
you.
at concrete.
Now you have about a minute to decide which of these things you think would be the first choice for most people. What do you think, Ben? I'm
Well,
not sure about this.
No,
What's your view?
it's a tricky one, I think, because for most people, I don't know. I could say for me, but perhaps I would say probably doing physical activity because I think most people appreciate the benefits of physical activity and it's available to all people to, whether you go to a gym or just go running or do it in your home, do exercises in your home. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think you might be right because although I love getting presents, not everybody gives me a present with and also the other things that we mentioned might be connected more with having the opportunity to being able to look at nature or having music available or having groups to socialize with, whereas anybody anywhere can do physical activity and it's free. Just go out for a walk or a run and get outside and do something physical. So, yeah, I agree with you. Physical activity.
Yeah, I think we're on the
Thank you.
same page there. Okay. So yeah, tricky for Craig, but finishing, quickly changing from one role to another. So well done, Craig.
Thank you.
Sterling work. Well, first of all, Craig, perhaps you could give your evaluation on our performances in that case. Did
Well,
we
I
do
thought
well?
I did very well. I was pleased
I
with my
I
performance.
agree. Couldn't agree
Um,
more.
yeah, I think first of all we should focus on the way we both did it, bearing in mind the way the C1 test is, and that is, if you noticed, we tried to move the task forward.
Mm-hmm.
So Ben started by talking about doing physical activity, and then I jumped in and moved it on by saying, let's move on to, or you could say, moving on to communicating with others. So make sure you're moving the task forward and you're not only discussing one point. Now, it's not, you don't have to discuss all of the ideas, but you should be moving the task forward during those first 2 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's so important for many reasons. I mean, you're giving more content to the examiners. The examiners want content to be able to evaluate, but also it's easier for you because if you get stuck on one of the prompts, you're probably going to have to start repeating yourself or your partner, the vocabulary or ideas. So just be conscious that you have to keep moving on. And I mean, Craig started very well, of course. I mean, I started, but Craig responded to what I said. So it's not just about moving on without responding. You have to, Craig said, I don't know if you said I completely agree or I agree. I couldn't agree more.
Mm-hmm.
And then he responded and added something and then moved on. So it's this interaction. So you have to include your partner, respond to your partner, but move on to the next prompt. So I think we spoke about 4 prompts, didn't we? Which is, I think,
Yeah.
3 or 4 between. I mean, 5 if you can. But as you said, it's not like part 2 where you have to answer both questions. In part 3, the prompts are there to stimulate. They're prompts. They're there to prompt a conversation or discussion, but you don't have to speak about all of them. But yeah, I recommend at least 3.
Yeah.
Um,
Another point I think it's important to make is how we asked for our opinions. What do you think? What's your view? I think that. So you must remember to ask for your partner's opinion
mhm,
and agree or disagree. And we
mhm.
both agreed with each other, I think. Um,
Yep, I think
yeah.
pretty much on everything, which is fine. You've seen that there are 2 tasks. There's the 2-minute task where you're discussing the question in the middle. And a big mistake that people make here is that they start choosing one. So, well, I think this is the most important. That's the second task, the 1-minute task. That's where you have to come to some kind of, you have to negotiate towards a decision together. So you don't have to agree, um, but you have to go through the process of discussing the best, the most, the least, whatever. So yeah, we agreed a lot in the first task, and I think we agreed in the second task. But I often recommend to my students that they disagree because if you just for the second task, if you just agree, sometimes it's difficult to add new vocabulary or new content. Craig did it very well, but for some students, non-native speakers, it's a bit more challenging. So sometimes it's easier just to disagree and say, well, so I said doing physical activity, but maybe the partner may say, yeah, I take your point, but actually I think communicating with others is more appropriate because, and then you have more to say, but it wasn't necessary here. So yeah, it's all about interaction. And that's my question to you, Craig. Again, in this speaking paper, there are 5 criteria, but I would imagine that in the collaborative task, the interactive communication is, I don't know if we can say the most important, but it's extremely important, right?
It is extremely important. And I think the interactivity of your speaking, interacting with your partner shows itself more in this part of the test than in the other parts. But of course, in the other parts, you're also interacting with the examiner.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent in part 4 too. So that's also important. But you can really see and I as an examiner used to look for those functions of, what do you think? What's your view? Yeah, I agree 100%. You said I couldn't agree more, which is a
Mm-hmm.
lovely expression for agreeing. I'm sorry, I can't see it that way. All those expressions of agreeing and disagreeing and asking for giving opinion, here they really shine. So make sure you use them
Mm-hmm.
and make sure you're interacting as much as possible with your partner and just have a chat, have a conversation and
Yeah.
make it like a tennis match.
Mm.
One problem I see is that one student will, not intentionally, but one student will kind of monopolize as a monologue and keep speaking, and the other student is too polite to jump in.
Mm.
So you end up having one student speaking for 1 minute and then the other student speaking for another minute. That's not really interacting as people normally do. You have to think of like a
Exactly.
tennis match where it's ping pong,
Mm.
backwards and forwards,
Yeah.
agreeing and disagreeing.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want monologues. You don't want just one person speaking and then the other person trying to respond to everything that their partner has said. Yeah, pass the ball. I always talk about passing the ball regularly. Um, yeah, that's so important. So you mentioned, people get very nervous in the speaking paper. So it may not mean they're nasty people or they're horrible people if they dominate. They just may be nervous, and if they're not prepared, they may not understand how to do the task. So you may find that your partner dominates, but you have to take the initiative. The interlocutor is not going to help you here. They can't interrupt. They can't really do anything except ask the questions in this case. So yeah, I mean, as you said, people tend to be a little bit too polite, too nice. But you have to be, if you find your partner's been speaking for a minute or even 45 seconds, then usually just by making some kind of sound, just saying, yeah, that's usually enough to sort of just to get the attention of your partner, and then they'll realize that they've been speaking too much. But if you need to say,
Or wait until your partner takes a breath because they have to breathe, right? So they're going to
usually,
say, and I think listening to music is very good.
can I
And
jump
that's
in?
when
Yeah,
that's when you speak. That's when you speak and
exactly.
you say, yes, I agree, because, and then you say what you think. And then don't forget to throw it back
Mm,
to the other person so that it is fair and you're having a conversation.
exactly. I always I always recommend to my students that they start the collaborative tasks because that sets the tone. They will be prepared. They know what they have to do. So the person who starts sets the tone for the rest of the conversation. Usually, if you start with a 20-second contribution, it's human nature usually that your partner will respond more or less with 20 seconds. If you start with 1 minute, your partner is going to respond with a 1 minute contribution. So
That's a
yeah,
good point.
yeah, always remember to give your partner the opportunity, respond, but then always give the ball back. Don't hold on for it for too long. As I said, when you're
Mm.
nervous, it's difficult to remember these things, but it's very important for these interactive tasks, or this collaborative task, as this is called.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think we did very well. Um,
Yes, I think we both pass, Ben.
Before we move on to part 4, I did just want to mention that we've spoken about if you have a partner who speaks too much, who's dominant, but if you have a partner who is perhaps very nervous, then help them. It's to your benefit that your partner collaborates with you, and the examiners will really appreciate that and notice. So yes, interrupt if your partner speaks too much, but if your partner doesn't say enough, then try to encourage them to participate more, to respond more, to say more.
Yeah, especially if they're struggling with vocabulary or they get stuck and you see that they're lost, then you jump in,
Yeah,
maybe finish their thought and then ask them a question, give them a chance to kind of collect their thoughts and recover. But yeah, well, maybe we should mention what we spoke about before. If your partner isn't really speaking, then it's up to you to ask your partner questions to get them to try and speak. That's good interaction.
Yeah.
And as we mentioned earlier, if your partner's speaking too much, that's when you need to jump in and interrupt politely and make sure that you're also contributing to the conversation. And don't worry if your partner doesn't let you interrupt, because the examiner will notice that. What the examiner is looking for is for you to try to interrupt and get in the discussion. And if your partner, maybe you don't know your partner and your partner's just refusing and wants to speak for 2 minutes, then as long as you've tried to interrupt and tried to interject, then that is enough to mark your partner down and mark you up.
Exactly. Yeah. If your partner doesn't do well, doesn't do things appropriately, that's not going to reflect on you, as long as you make the effort to interact and make it manage the conversation in some ways. Okay, so we can move on to the discussion part. So that's the last part of the speaking paper. So it would just be, there's no strict time limit for this part of the exam. It will just be until the end of the exam. It's usually about 4 minutes. And as I said before, this will be the conversation or discussion questions on the same theme, the same topic as the part 3 collaborative task. So if there's any vocabulary that you didn't use and you realized when you finished, oh, I could have said this, I wish I'd said this, maybe you'll have an opportunity in the discussion, maybe not necessarily, but you have 4 minutes to have a nice discussion with your partner. I think this is the best part of the exam. It's where you can just hopefully have a nice chat, but it still is an exam task. So you still need to think about, as Craig says, like playing the tennis, I say pass the ball. Don't hold on to the ball for too long. You want to include your partner, respond to your partner, and this interaction, it's still interactive task. So as I said, we'll talk about it more when we're finished, but Mr. Interlocutor, when you're ready, we can continue.
Okay. So, Ben, do you agree that some people are naturally happy all the time?
That's an interesting one. Superficially, yes, I think that's possible. I think they may seem to be happy all the time. They have that sort of positive and happy, optimistic nature. But I imagine under the surface, if you scratch the surface, you may see that. I don't believe that anybody can be happy all the time. I think everybody has their ups and downs. What do you think?
Yes, I think that's true. I think people do sometimes appear happy when they're not, but that's all part of social pressure and how we're expected to behave in particular situations. And I think it's very, very difficult to be happy all the time. I don't know many people who are.
No, me neither. But if you believe Instagram, then there are some people who are just having the best life every day. They're always on holiday, always smiling and enjoying every second of the day, and it can be dangerous, I think. So yeah, no, I think some people just naturally present a positive and optimistic appearance, but it's everybody is human and has their problems.
So, what do you think will be the best way to achieve long-term happiness?
Ooh, that's a tough one. That's a deep question.
It's a deep question, isn't it?
Deep one, yeah. I think probably finding, and I'm going to answer a deep question with a deep answer. Finding some kind of inner peace with yourself. It's not something external. What do you think, Craig?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think long-term happiness, constant happiness is possible because of the human condition. I think contentment is possible. We can be contented maybe in a long-term basis, but probably not happy. I think to focus on the small things helps. If you try not to spend time regretting the past and worrying about the future, and if you focus more on now, and at this moment, here I am recording a video with Ben, hoping to help you get past your C1 exam. That's given me happiness, that's given me pleasure. And if you focus on now, and you're eating that lovely food, or you're having that wonderful coffee, or you're walking in the sunshine and being in the moment, I think that helps to be content most of the time. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. I think it's it's um it's all about not projecting what could happen in the future or living in the past. It's just living in the moment and doing the best you can, and don't obsess over it too much. Don't obsess over happiness. Yeah.
And one final question: how important do you think it is not to show other people how you really feel?
I don't think it's important at all. I think you should show other people how you feel in most situations. I think it's okay to express your emotions, to cry when you're sad, to laugh when you're happy. Perhaps in some professional situations you want to cover it up a little bit, but I think in modern times I don't think people need to hide their emotions so much. Would you agree?
I agree with certain professions that it's probably a good idea not to show other people how you feel. For example, in business, or if you're a professional poker player and you're betting for money, it's a good idea not to show people that you've really got a good set of cards in your hand. And there are some professions where it's probably better to, as they say, have a poker face and not show your feelings. But generally speaking, especially with social connections and relationships, I think it's quite good to wear your heart on your sleeve, as they say, and let people know how you feel. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree
And
more.
thank you. That's a good,
That's
nice place to finish, I think.
Yeah, excellent.
Yep.
So we had three questions there, which I think is good. I think I always recommend. Just one thing I was thinking while we were doing that, and I've noticed when I do these practice tests with my students, they tend to find it difficult to end the conversation. They tend to keep on talking and then they start repeating themselves and finding
Yeah.
it difficult because I think neither of the candidates wants to be the one to end the conversation. But as you can see, the interlocutor has, I think, 5 or 6 questions to ask, so there won't be a problem. And often it's better to stop speaking about one question because then you have more input to speak about more and give more content to the examiners.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'd agree with that for sure.
Okay, good. And what's your evaluation on that last part then? How did we do?
Yes, I think we did okay. I think they were interesting questions, and I think we answered them truthfully. Would you recommend that your students lie if they can't think of anything to say?
Uh, yeah, as a last what
Last resort.
is that what you did? Is it, as a
Well,
last resort, yeah, the worst case scenario, yeah.
yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, not about where you live or things that obviously you know the answer to, but for example, with the pictures, perhaps in part two, sometimes if people dry up and they've answered the questions and there's still 10 or 15 seconds remaining and they don't know what to say, then I say, well, personalize one of the pictures. I prefer going canoeing because I really like being in nature. Maybe that's not true, but you
Yeah.
can extend it another few seconds. So in some, you can bend the truth a little bit sometimes to keep speaking. I think that's okay.
Yes, I mean, I do. I often say that the examiners don't really care whether you're telling the truth or not. They don't care if you really go canoeing or not. And they don't
Yeah,
know. It doesn't
exactly.
matter. The only problem with that is that it is more difficult to talk about something which is not authentic in any
Absolutely.
language to sort of invent things. But that's why I said, as a last resort, if you just can't think of anything to say, and you don't think, well, actually, I can't say that because it's not true. If you have something to say, and it's not true, it doesn't matter, say it. But yeah, the
Yeah.
problem is if you start with a lie, then it's very difficult, or not a lie, but start by inventing things, then it's difficult to continue. And but it's
Exactly.
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But one thing to add, I think, is that the questions sometimes are quite interesting. So my advice will be also to try to get seriously interested in the question and answering it from your perspective with your personal point of view, because at C1 you do have enough English to be able to explain your thoughts and your opinions. And especially in part four, it's the perfect time. You're feeling a bit more relaxed, as Ben said, and it's a great part of the exam to show them the English you've got and really say what you think about these questions.
Yeah, exactly. Really try to. I think that's a good tip for the whole exam. I mean, even the reading and listening. People just see these as exam tasks. But if you can really try to enjoy what enjoy is maybe a strong word, but get deep into it, like really absorb what you're reading and listening to, and really think deeply about the questions, it's easier to answer them. It's not just superficially. At C1 level and definitely C2 level, it's the questions get a little bit more philosophical or slightly deeper. So it's worth
Yeah,
really thinking about your answers. Yeah, I agree.
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that would be the end of the exam. So we've completed it. So
Did we pass?
uh, I think, yeah, I can speak for you that you passed, especially as you were sort of juggling being the interlocutor and the partner and evaluating. So it's a lot to do. So well done. Would you say I passed?
Oh yes, yeah, without a
Thank you very much.
doubt. Yeah,
That's
you
a
are
relief.
you are now a C1 guy.
C1, so I can put that on my CV that I have a C1 level of English. I was quite worried because I would be humiliated in front of all the viewers that think I'm an expert in these exams, and if I failed it, it would be embarrassing. But fortunately, I passed my C1 speaking exam. So thank you, Craig. Anything to add before we finish?
Yeah, there's one thing I would add, and I don't think it's spoken about enough, and that's when you're going in to do the test, it is an interview. It's not a natural situation, and as much as we tell you to try and relax and get into it and enjoy it and get involved in the questions, etc. For general interview technique, make sure you are making eye contact with the examiner or with your partner. In part three, maybe turn your chair just a little so you're looking at your partner when you're speaking and you're not looking at the examiner. And be aware of your body language. Don't look down at your feet. Smile. All those things that you probably have seen on other YouTube channels about how to make a good impression at a job interview. Try to remember that. Don't sit with your arms folded. Make sure you've got an open and an attractive way of speaking. Maybe use your hands a little bit to help you communicate, and that will also help you, I think, in the test. Do you agree with that, Ben? Or do you think
100%.
it's
Yeah.
too much to think about?
No, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. As you mentioned, it makes a good impression, and the examiners are human. I think if you look confident, if you appear confident, then the examiners they're not evaluating your body language, of course, but it is
No.
important. But I think also if you kind of make eye contact and smile and think about your body language, I think it does affect your confidence yourself. I think if you kind of go through the motions and almost like acting, you're playing a role, so it makes you feel like you're a confident person if you act in a confident way. So yeah, I often
Yeah.
it's difficult because we're practicing just looking and we're looking at screens, so we can't see the body language. But yeah, as you said, in the exam, you'll be in the same room, so you'll be sitting next to your partner. Uh, Body language, facial expressions, non-verbal communication is part of it, although it's not
Definitely.
officially evaluated. Yeah,
Yeah,
excellent,
it helps. Yeah.
excellent point. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, fantastic, Craig. Thank you so much for that. Excellent,
Thank you.
excellent, very professionally done and very useful, I think. So again, to everyone watching, I'm going to put um, Craig's all the links to Craig's podcast, website, his conversation classes in the description. So I highly recommend you check those out. Get in touch with Craig, and yeah, and hope to see you on the channel again soon, Craig. It's been a pleasure.
It's been fun. Thank you for having me on. And if you are out there just about to take your C1 advanced exam, good luck.
Mm-hmm.
Watch this video again, make notes, keep practicing, and I'm sure you'll be fine. So thanks for watching, and
Excellent
thank you,
advice.
Ben.
Thank you, Craig.